Okay, so welcome to the first discussion of the Mosque of Renewal. We're hoping that the Mosque of Renewal is a place where we renew the tradition, where we empower ourselves to learn how to interpret the tradition, the texts, the everything that is handed down to us, and to figure out how to implement it into our lives, um, and therefore make Islam an active practice. So this is the first of our discussions.
Hmm.
We're going to be talking today about the sources of authority in Islam and how each of us make decisions um, about how we practice Islam. My name is Gabriel Campbell.
I'm Hassana Patterson.
I use he, him, his pronouns.
I use she, her,
Um,
hers.
yeah, and yeah, we're here today at the beautiful fireside chat room at Plymouth Congregational Church, where Mosque of Renewal is held every Saturday night.
It's pretty
Um,
dank.
yeah, it's pretty cool. It's good. It's the last day of Ramadan,
Is
so
it?
it, no, sorry, it's not the last day of Ramadan. It's the last Mosque of Renewal of Ramadan. So this is the last so after we finish this, we're gonna have iftar, and then when we meet next week, Ramadan will be over.
Oh shit.
Um, and we're gonna be actually meeting. We're gonna be at the Eid al Fitr, Eid al
Yeah, the one
picnic.
that Nikki's doing.
Yeah, at Indian Mounds Park.
Chance Health, yo.
Yeah, you can find
Chance
it
for
on.
Trans Health.
We're gonna have a link, hopefully, in our Facebook group, and you can also find it at a Facebook event.
Links in the description.
Yeah, if we make this like a YouTube video.
Don't
Oh
forget to
man.
like, comment, favorite, and subscribe.
But yeah, so we're gonna be there celebrating Eid next week. So we're not going to do a discussion like this, but then we'll be back the week after that.
Mhm.
As always, we encourage you to come and join the conversation. So I think
Yeah.
without further ado, we can get started. Yeah.
Should we include that part where we're like, this has been a LibriVox recording?
No.
Okay.
Especially because I don't think we're gonna be doing a lot of editing. I personally don't
Right.
plan on doing a lot of editing. All right.
Okay.
So how about we first talk about our journeys to Islam? How did you find Islam, and what attracted you to Islam, or attracts you to Islam today?
Oh, I don't need the first one to answer. You answer.
Okay, I can go first. I found Islam in college. A friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine actually, were practicing Muslims. And growing up in America in a predominantly Christian society, um, Christianity as the religion of power was often used to justify a lot of harm. And that doesn't mean I think that's the heart of Christianity, but as a kid, when I couldn't really distinguish between the two, I really disliked Christianity because I felt, I disliked a lot of religions as well, because I felt like religions couldn't be trusted with God. I
Hmm.
was like, God is this ultimate source of goodness, and then religions kind of screw it up somehow. So I was really protective of faith and of God, and I didn't want to join any specific religion, and especially not Christianity, because in my experience, it had been the religion where people would say things like, "All gay people are going to hell." Um, and then when I was in college, I had some friends who were Muslim, and I remember sitting with one of them, and one was having a problem. I forget exactly what it was, but she was concerned about something. And what another one of my friends said to her was just love and have faith. And that was the most open expression of religion I had ever heard. Something I was just love and have faith. And so that kind of started me on this journey of being interested in Islam and wanting to know more about it. And
Hmm.
eventually, due to the way that I saw them practicing, the way I saw them being in the world, that was what ultimately drew me to Islam. Because personally, I think that's the only way you can be drawn to religion. It's you see someone
Hmm.
practicing it in a way that you find beautiful.
Yeah,
And I wanted to practice in a way that I found beautiful as well.
for sure. So I was in high school. I was like 17. It was like the last 2 months of my junior year, and I was living in like rural Wisconsin, like in a town. It was a town outside of Cumberland, but I went to school in Cumberland. And I at the time was like atheistic, but I was regularly involved in like a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Like I would try to study other religions and like stuff, and develop like sort of take away what like interesting things I could from them about their like sort of mythos and sort of grand narrative. But I was also having sort of a spiritual like sort of crisis about like feeling that there needs to be something in the world, a sort of greater order of things. And I remember like in my town, like people would always like talk shit about like the Somalis who lived in the neighboring town, Barron. So I wanted to like I was at the time reading the Quran, and I like wanted to go. I had a car at the time, so I also uh, drove over there to like actually meet people like who were like Somali, to like actually meet them and like see if like, because I think I personally thought the people I was talking to in my high school were just full of racist Islamophobic bullshit. So I was like, okay, I'll actually meet Muslims, like hang out with them, like talk to them, and like see what the faith is like, and I was really sort of enamored with it. Like I it was just everything felt right, everything felt like, and reading the Quran, everything felt right. So like I sort of just jumped into it. Like I converted. I Yeah, so that's my story. It's just like being 17, well, 17 and a half, and um, finding a small, rural Wisconsin community that was Muslim, and just getting super into it. Like I would go like to Barron like every like several times a week to like study at the mosque, like eat halal food, like you know, and like just do the prayers there to like hear them, so it wasn't just me like sort of praying along to a little like children's book and a DVD, like trying to memorize it, like. But yeah, that was sort of my early experience with this with Islam. It's just like having that community where I could like go to like ask questions and stuff, and like you know, have that.
So it kind of sounds like one of the things that kind of drew both of us to Islam is that we had these experiences
Mm.
where we felt that there was room to explore and to ask questions and to really like connect with something that felt true to us.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, since starting this journey, I know that there are plenty of people in the world who have this experience where they experience Islam as a set of rules that like can be restrictive. Like I remember one of the first interactions I had with a friend of mine. Um, I had just recently like said my shahada, and I was going up to a 10-day retreat by a lake. Like there was going to be nothing there. And she said, "Oh, well, see if you can maybe find some other Muslims, or if you can go down to a nearby town to make sure you pray on Friday." And
Mm-hmm.
it just seemed like such like a weird thing to do. Like it wasn't like, "Oh, I want you to make sure that." She wasn't saying it because she was thinking like, "I want you to have this great experience of praying on a Friday
Yeah,
afternoon or to
or to
meet
have
other
community. It's because
Muslims."
you have that obligation.
Yeah, yeah, it was this feeling that there was, well, the rules say you like, especially if you're a man, you're supposed to pray on Friday at this time. So make sure you do that. And there was almost like an or else hovering in the air, even though she didn't
Which
say
is
what it
it's
was.
conceptually fascinating because like in the sort of jurisprudence, like if you're traveling or if you're like not in a town like that has a certain amount of Muslims, you're actually not obligated to pray to pray the Friday prayer, to do the Jummah.
Well, okay, that kind of gets into it. So like, if you're a person who is like told, here's what the rule is,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and you think maybe that doesn't make quite sense or just doesn't feel right to you, then what sources do you go to say to like combat that interpretation? What did you mean when you say like the jurisprudence?
Yeah, so I'm just saying like when I think of like Islam, I often think about it in terms of like all the books I've read on like classical jurisprudence, and like sort of that's where I typically like went to as far as like what are the rules, because like there's so many people that have like differing interpretations of like you know just small little minute details of religion. Like I think people are often told Islam in a way that's sort of disconnected from that sort of scholarly tradition. I always want to go to the scholars to have those sort of the most legitimate answer, because the scholars had this air of legitimacy. It's to me, it's almost sort of like it's sort of like the concept of apostolic succession in Catholicism, where they have the lines of popes that went back to Jesus supposedly. Um, I believe that I at one point believed the scholars had like a line of succession back to the prophet, and those had the monopoly on the right interpretation of Islam. So through that scholarship, I had a certain fetishization of the scholarship of the like things like permission to teach and the chain of you know what is it the chain of like teaching sheikh to sheikh to sheikh, like back to Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And like that's why I got so into like not even like reading like Quran and Hadith and stuff and trying to interpret for myself, but just like memorizing the positions of scholars to know what in theory the rules should be. But I mean, I don't necessarily know if that's right for me now. Like I think they were dealing with limited knowledge, and like I think I often like if you look at the sort of the supposed chains that they go back to, there's a lot of holes. Like so, some of the chains like go back through Khidr. Are you familiar with Khidr? So there's the story of this guy named Khidr in the Quran, and he's supposed to be like this immortal person who like lives on forever, and like there's a story about him and Musa alayhi salam, where they like Musa like walks with them for a while, and Khidr does
Okay.
three really messed up things, and like
Yeah.
Moses asks him about it, and like he's like,
You
"Why'd you do
couldn't
that?"
have
And
patience with me.
he had a reason for it, and each one of them. So a lot of people believe that Khidr's like still around and still like sort of a mystical figure who like appears invisibly, and like some of these chains actually trace their lineage through Khidr appearing to a sheikh, learning from that sheikh, and then proceeding to generations later,
Hmm.
broken chain, teaching another sheikh.
Okay.
So like there's some ridiculousness in some of these chains. So like I don't think they're as infallible as I once did. And like I because of all the like homophobia and the sort of like neo traditionalism, like I've sort of had my sort of break with being like strictly that. But I also feel like that's sort of my formative base for Islam. So when I say like jurisprudence, like I'm just thinking in terms of like the four madhabs. Like I followed one, I followed Shafi'i, and I like learned it like and studied it like extensively. So like when I think about like how do I like if I were to pray right now, I would pray according to the method that I learned how to pray by.
Mhm.
And like I don't think anymore that would be the exclusively best way to do it would be according to the four method. But I still like that's how I learned, so that's just how I go by. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know what do you go by? Because I feel like you probably go by something different that I'm really interested and I want to know.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I really like about Islam is, at least, again, I'm not saying this is exclusive to Islam because I've since come to understand that you can find this interpretation and this understanding and this orientation towards religion in many different religions. But one of the things that initially drew me to Islam was the idea that there was no barrier between you and God. There was no person that you had to go to. There was no like specific priest. There was no like. It's such a strong element of the religion, and it says over and over again in the Quran that like on the day of judgment, it's just going to be you and God. Like no one can intercede for you,
Wait, does it say this
unless
somewhere?
yeah, unless God gives permission for them to intercede. But it's just this idea that you are ultimately accountable for what you do before God. Like
Mm.
everyone has ultimate accountability for their own for their own actions in this world, their own intentions in this world. And so, I really appreciate that idea that like even though I could look to others, that I could look to the scholars, that I could look to fellow Muslims, that I could look to them as people who, just like me, are sincerely trying to figure out how to live good lives, how to live godly lives, how to be good Muslims. Um, Ultimately, I would be held responsible for what I chose to do and
Mhm.
what I did in this world and how I interpreted this tradition. So that's kind of that's the balance that I feel that I've struck at this point in my life, between the tradition and my own responsibility towards interpreting that tradition.
Mhm.
That like everyone who had lived in the past and who lives in the present They're all sincere. Hopefully, they're sincere,
Hmm.
sincerely trying to understand the tradition. And for that reason, I should listen to them and hear what they have to say and try to be grateful for their guidance. But they're also human, and
Sure.
therefore, it can make mistakes. And I think one of the things that I really love, like one of my favorite um, phrases in Islam, is "wa which
Hmm.
is like what happened when scholars were writing things and they would write interpretations and they'd be like, this is what I think is true and this is what I think people should be doing and this is what I think God wants us to do. And at the very end they would say wa lakhala, but
Yeah.
God knows best.
Hmm.
Like even though I have put my sincere effort into trying to figure this out, at the end of the day I am human. I do not know. God knows best.
Yeah.
um, and so when I try to figure something out in Islam, I will often try to. I'll turn to the Quran first and foremost. I'll turn to the Sunnah, um, like the biography of the Prophet, the Hadith that I have read,
Hmm.
and I'll also turn to my own intuition and my own mind. Like it's not just
Yeah.
logical reasoning, but it's also kind of gets back to the idea of just love and have faith. Like
Hmm. For sure.
if the ultimate orientation of God, like if mercy comes before wrath, like anything that counteracts this that is ugly or counteracts this idea of compassion and mercy and just doesn't seem to manifest compassion and mercy in the world,
Hmm.
then that's really suspect to me. I'm going to really doubt an interpretation that leads to something that's ugly and unjust
Yeah.
and just not compassionate towards other human beings or towards life or respectful towards life.
Hmm.
Um, and if that's what the interpretation is saying, I'm probably going to think that it's wrong somehow. Like I'm not necessarily going to just disregard it, but I'm going to be like, there's probably something wrong with that. I'm going to have to go look a little bit more. Let me look at the Quran. Let me look at the biography of the Prophet. Let me look at the Hadith. Let me look at
Hmm.
how, and then to the extent that I have access to the scholars, let me look at how scholars and jurists have looked at this or
Hmm.
have understood this point. Um, and for that reason, I think it's so important to have access to what scholars and jurists have said because I think that the conversation for these past 1400 years has been incredibly deep and wide and nuanced, and
Hmm.
because of the effects of colonialism all over the
Absolutely.
world,
Yeah.
there has been a broken tradition. Um, and I say that as an African American who's very familiar with the idea of broken traditions.
Hmm.
I can't trace my lineage back past the Atlantic Ocean for the most part. Like I can use ancestry DNA and kind of know the general, but I don't know the
Hmm.
culture of my ancestors.
The
So
language, the tribe.
yeah, and so one of the things we're dealing with here, just as African Americans, is trying to figure out, really starting to wrestle with the idea of a broken tradition.
Hmm.
Like it's not just like in some ways, sure, we've made a lot of progress in slavery. Like, okay, we're free most of the time, right? Unless we get locked up for some reason.
Stop by the place, or like,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we're still living in a pretty apartheid system. So
Hopefully, people we all know the nuances of the argument. I don't want to get into
yeah, for sure.
nuances of the African American experience, but I think that one of the things that I see coming out in conversations in African American communities now is this understanding of the effect of a broken tradition.
Hmm.
And you see this, I think, kind of exemplified in the way that African Americans reacted to Black Panther. Right? We're
Hmm.
like, oh man, suddenly we can see ourselves in places of power and places of beauty and in places of intelligence.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, and that was so great about that is that you start to realize how much that was missing before.
Hmm.
So there's this idea of how much an effect of a broken tradition can have on the people. I see the same thing in Islam a little bit. Like there's this feeling like there's a broken tradition. Like yeah, there are some scholars who are very much aware of the tradition and can kind of quote all the jurists, but
Hmm.
the average everyday Muslim just kind of gives you this very flat two-dimensional interpretation
Oh yeah,
of the
absolutely.
tradition. Says I had one little girl walk up to me and say Muslims don't listen to music, or
Yeah.
someone will come up to me like dogs are unclean, and it's like, are there any nuances to
Or like
these
saying
understanding? Like,
people will like tell you like on the street like, did you know that if a dog licks you it's a sin? And you're just like, no, actually, I like, and it'll be like a Somali kid for example, and like Somalis typically for the last several hundred years have followed the Shafi'i madhab, and according to that madhab, it's not a sin. It's just that you have to make wudu 7 times, which inconvenient, yes, but is that a sin? Is that haram? No, it's nowhere in the fiqh doesn't say it's haram. It just says you have to make 7 wudu, which is almost worse than saying. I mean, I sin every day, but I do not make 7 wudu.
yeah.
But
So I guess like I want to feel empowered. I'm trying just to like educate myself even more so. I feel some ways like I'll never be educated enough, but I want to feel empowered, and I want other Muslims to feel empowered to
mhm,
like question some of these truly like at best flat and unconvincing, and at worst ugly interpretations of the Quran. Because like the thing
and
that
often spiritually dry.
yeah, and I feel like the thing that happens like when you narrow a tradition that much
Hmm.
is that it stops having the ability to actually engage with the complexity of the human experience.
Hmm.
Right? Like human lives are very complex and layered and complicated, and I feel like we all need religious traditions, spiritual traditions to help us navigate the fundamental human experience of being a conscious being, of like
Yeah.
having a consciousness. Like spiritual traditions are built up around the idea that we have a consciousness, and like the state of our consciousness affects how we move through the world, affects how we experience the world, affects our lives, and
Hmm.
therefore we should have a way of looking at it, interrogating it,
Oh yeah.
making it better.
Critically.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
like I feel like every human being needs that.
Hmm.
And maybe it's a spiritual path. Now we kind of have this nascent, hopefully it'll continue to grow, but this nascent path of like therapy and psychiatry that's also trying to help human beings like really wrestle with their own consciousness and try to improve it
Hmm.
and deal with the problems that can arise from just being a human being.
Hmm.
Because that's something that we all need. And if for like one what are we at now? 1/5 of the human beings on the planet who are Muslim, if like their tradition has
Yeah, bud.
become so narrowed that it can no longer help them engage with the problems of being a human being, with
Hmm.
the like task of being a human being and making yourself better, then that's like a grave injustice and a grave like problem for a large swath of the human race.
Hmm.
So like I guess that's what I think about when I think about how Islam is interpreted, how I interpret it. Like for my own self, I want to have this very full tradition that helps me continue to be a human being and be a better human being, and I want that
Hmm.
for others as well. So I don't know, that's where I'm at. That's what I'm thinking right
That's all awesome, and there's a lot to think about right there. Um, I think I think contrasting like the experiences of the broken tradition of Islam and the broken tradition of like the Afro American experience like is really conceptually interesting to me because like I feel like yeah, there's a lot that like has been lost through like slavery and like colonization, like the way the subjugation that like existed and continues to exist. But I also do think that with like Afro Americans, there is a sort of cultural vibrance that exists that emerged as a sort of response to that, like sort of a remix, if you will, like a taking Afro Americans taking what they have and like you know making things like jazz, like hip hop, like a lot of the sort of things that like define what I mean what most of the world thinks of as the American experiences, but in America like are seen as the Afro American experience, and like I think is that what could be the possibility of like of Islam is like this idea of like taking the old and like making a new sort of remix, a sort of a reimagining, a reinvigoration.
now. That's an interesting question. I don't know because I feel like you have there's a lot of variety of reactions to the oppression experienced by African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
One of them has definitely been this outpouring of like art and culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we also see some of the darker sides where it's like these very like weird or narrow like attempts to kind of reclaim dignity, but by putting someone else down. So, like for example, I saw this video on YouTube that was talking about how Africans were really the first ones to arrive in the Americas and taught the indigenous people culture. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's still an incredibly racist view. Like
Yeah,
you're assuming that indigenous people needed to be taught
didn't have
culture.
culture.
Yeah, they need to be like civilized by
Yeah,
someone. The
and
fact
they
that
had
you
cities, like they had things.
Yeah, the fact that you just replaced Europeans with Africans doesn't actually make it better, So
Mm-hmm.
like I've seen some like dark corners of the Afro-American experience where
Yeah,
there's just this kind of like African supremacy, but it's like based on this very narrow reading of history or very like simplified understanding of African history.
there's some conspiracism that, like that I see a lot of those circles in. Like, that's, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't feel like I should be like necessarily like judging it like as a white person, like because I don't have that I have the place to like necessarily like condemn it, but like I think there's like yeah.
Yeah. Well, the connection to that I was thinking is that like sometimes I feel like that happens in Islam. It kind of has happened
Mm-hmm.
in Islam where like the dark corners of the we're gonna use a very narrow interpretation of our history and create this very like two dimensional
Yeah.
weak interpretation of Islam
Mm-hmm.
has kind of taken hold. I don't know if that's true. It just
Mm-hmm.
feels like a lot of what I hear and what I see in like Muslim communities here in the U.S., but also in Muslim communities in like the Muslim majority world, is this very like despotic interpretation of Islam, where you get groups like ISIS and you get groups like the Taliban, and that's not
Yeah.
everyone. Well, you get ISIS and Taliban, but then you also get like unjust like political regimes in some of the countries as
Mm-hmm.
well. And like that's not everyone. That's not I would even say the majority of Muslims in the world, but like it's like a small group have kind of hijacked the ability or the right for themselves, I guess, to speak for the entirety of the religion, like
Sure.
Wahhabism, Salafism, and such.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I'm kind of wondering, like, why did that happen? Like that, like if we're comparing the African American experience to the Islamic experience, like in the African American experience, I feel like those elements that had like come up with the more narrow, ugly
Mm-hmm.
interpretations of like African supremacy have always existed, but they didn't
Yeah.
reach majority status. They didn't have power over the entire African American narrative or like
Yeah,
loom
they
large.
really don't. They're sort
Yeah,
of fringe.
but that seems to have happened in Islam. Like,
Yeah.
why do you think that happened?
Well, I think okay, so if you look at like Salafism, like it's a movement that seeks to sort of revive by looking back at the experiences of the Salaf, the first three generations after Muhammad. So like there's a sort of fetishization of that narrative over like the narrative in between that and the 1400 years since. So like a lot of it will just be like using going back to the textual sources as a sort of rhetorical point for ignoring the 1400 years of like scholarly tradition and like the interesting sciences like Sufism and like theology and stuff, and like they end up coming up with their own versions of like the theological sciences, and they end up coming up with their own attempts at jurisprudence. So it's not like they don't have these sciences, and they're I don't know, but like the spread of Saudi Arabia and like the funding and the I mean a lot of countries had some degree of like destabilization on some like voids that were needing filling, and like Saudi Arabia had like an influx of money and was able to spread very quickly. I think that's what happened a lot with like Somalia, for example, where like Saudi Arabia would like be able was in a perfect position to show up when like the country was destabilized, and like um, I think they had an influence on a lot of countries like like Pakistan, the Sunnis of Iraq, like Egypt. They had a huge influence where like in Al Azhar they would like I think actually send a ton of like scholars to sort of influence the discussions that were happening at Al Azhar. But
So it kind of sounds like.
So I'm not just trying to blame it on Salafism because that's such an easy response, but like I feel like there were also like a lot of other sort of concurrent like revival movements that were sort of similar in practice, like Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood and like Abdullah Madudi from Pakistan, who sort of had sort of concurrent philosophies that were an attempt to go draw back to the textual sources, but in a way that was like sort of more conservative and like that I would get down to like the difference between like fundamentalism and traditionalism, which traditionalism can be like really strict and like sort of harsh in its own way, which I mean, I a few years ago could have been a very decent example of that. But fundamentalism differs in that it's an attempt to return back to the textual sources. I mean, it's like meeting someone who's like a strict traditionalist Catholic versus meeting someone who's like a evangelical. Like they're they're both going to be problematic in their own ways, but they're aesthetically different.
Mhm.
And like I think that's part of like, but also there. I mean, there's the effects of colonization, which I really haven't even gone into. Like I feel like, yeah, I really don't even have a real basis to touch on that because like I mean, there's just so much of it around the world, and like it's like I think like a lot of the Muslim world was developing in really interesting ways on like gay rights, for example, where like there was some degree of toleration for it, and like the Ottomans like at some point in the 18th century decriminalized it, but like once you had these like European countries like parsing out like the British in India or like the British and French in parts of the Middle East, like then you start seeing it like illegal everywhere, you know.
So, to kind of turn the conversation a little bit to a contemporary context,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say is the difference between people who are fundamentalists and try to like just go back to the Quran and back to the text to create their own interpretations and end up coming up with these like really fundamentalist,
Mm-hmm.
harsh interpretations, and like Muslims here in the West, we call it the West. I hate calling it the West because like it's really descendant of Europe. The West would be like indigenous people. Um,
Yeah.
but so here in our Euro descended societies,
Mm-hmm.
um, between people, especially I think I see this a lot among converts or reverts, however they want to be like referred to, between kind of the same idea. Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to ignore the tradition completely. I'm just going to look at the Quran and maybe like the biography of the prophet, maybe some hadith, and I'm going to decide for myself what the tradition is. Like, is there really a difference, like a qualitative difference between what you know reformers like that are doing and versus reformers that we would identify as fundamentalists?
So there's been like, I mean, harshness would definitely be like a reality. I think that's a real impact. I think like if you look at like the writings of, like Madudi or like Qutb, like there's a certain like coldness towards the tradition, like and like I think you can see that from like a lot of converts who have like severe convertitis, but I think there are also a lot of converts who are like doing like their attempts at like looking at the tradition, reanalyzing it with like a sense of love, and like I think this is a religion of love, like and like you need to have like a sense of like humility and love and like a respect for the tradition, and like if you come into the with the right reason, and I think the right like do I say aesthetic like but the right sort of
Intention.
yeah for sure that it would be a lot better than sort of like coming into it with a sense of like, you know, I'm going to one up those traditionalists. I'm going to get back to it the real way, and they've all been heretics for all these years. And like, because like a lot of the attempts by like Madudi and stuff was seeing people like, you know, doing things like intercession and like celebrating the birthday and like things that they disagreed with and they called heresy, and they were going to correct all the heretics. And it's like I love those practices. I seek intercession. I celebrate the birthday. Like I'm all about that life. And like I think that if you're going into Islam with this harsh heart of like I'm going to correct all these heresies that have come along the way and I'm going to bring us back to the true Islam, you're going to come up with a very mean spirited Islam. But like if you're coming into it like respectful of where other Muslims are at and like respectful of the tradition, like um, trying to create a loving faith, going back to the tradition can be really helpful. I think to like you know re-look at it, critically analyze it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think like one of the things that I hear leveraging, like for example, someone may call me like a progressive Muslim or a reformer Muslim, and one of the things I hear leveled against like progressives is this idea of, oh, you don't respect the tradition. I was actually at like a khutbah a couple of weeks ago, maybe like at this point 2 months ago, and
Mm-hmm.
this person was explicitly speaking against progressive Islam and was basically saying like these progressives are arrogant
Do you want to
because
say where?
no,
Okay,
because
sorry.
these progressives are disregarding the religion. And he said something that I disagree with. He said, "Who are you to like to think you're better than people who have come up with this like for 1400 years?" And I disagree with that because I'm like, well, I am a person. Like I am equal to any person who has ever lived,
Mm-hmm.
who will ever live, and who is living now. Because
Yeah.
I just fundamentally I am a human being.
I mean, those guys didn't have the
um,
internet.
so like I said, I don't think I'm better than the people who have lived before. Like I obviously can't judge that. Only God can judge that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't think I'm worse.
Yeah.
So like I think it's important to like I don't agree with people who just kind of throw out the religion and are like, I'm not going to do this,
Mm-hmm.
because I think what can happen is that you can very quickly fall prey to doing something just because you want to. Like your I think I'm going to say this wrong. Your caprices or something like that. That's like
Pants?
no,
Capri Sun?
kind of.
I'm sorry.
It's like caprice, I think, but it's one of those words I've only ever read.
Graciousness?
Yeah, capriciousness. But basically, like you have these whims, and like you can just quickly fall prey to just like following your whims, whatever they may be. Like, oh, I want to do this, so it must be from God. Ah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Like not like then you're not challenging yourself in any way to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm a teacher. As a teacher, I'm thinking like that's the student, like that's a teacher that just lets their student do whatever, right? Like you're not
Mm-hmm.
challenging them. You're not actually asking them to get better at whatever they're doing. You're just letting them go, and that's killing someone with faith praise. Or like that's not doing due diligence to your student, right? You're not helping them grow by just letting them do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you just insist that they do things the way you want them to do it, they're not going to grow either, right?
Yeah.
You have to find that balance between challenging someone and then helping them discover their own resources for being able to meet that challenge. And the challenge has to be appropriately um, moderated.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't think that we should just throw out the tradition.
Yeah.
If the tradition says something like "gay people are evil," I don't think you should just be like, "Well, f the tradition." Then I think you should then like challenge that. Be like, "Well, really, is that what the tradition says? On what basis? Let me actually look at the sources. Let me think about what have people said." And then in light of the context that we live in, how we currently understand homosexuality, how we currently understand mercy and compassion and human rights, what then do I think is the best attitude? What do I think is the Islamic attitude to have towards gay people?
I think some of Rumi's poetry is pretty good.
Yeah, I think we should do an entire another conversation on homosexuality. That'd be like,
yes.
I think that'd be really cool. But just today, talking about like that process of interrogating a tradition and engaging with it. And I think if you engage with it deeply, then you grow as a person and as a Muslim.
Absolutely.
And so, like, if progressive means that I do not just accept like a puritanical interpretation of Islam, then call me progressive. But I just think of myself as a Muslim who's out there doing the best I can.
Aww. Yeah, that seems pretty legit.
So
I mean, if progressive means throwing out the tradition, then I'm not a progressive. But if progressive means critically engaging it, then yeah, heck, I'm pretty progressive. Is it time to break fast?
It is. So
Awesome.
It is definitely time to break fast. Well, let me see. It's 8:58. Is that fast breaking time today?
8:50. Wasn't it 8:53 last week?
It was, but it was like 8:57 yesterday. Man, we should also have another conversation about like Fajr times, because I have a lot to say about false dawn versus civil dawn versus nautical dawn and how we do these like Fajr times.
Okay, did you know that okay, so here's one for the camera. Did you know that like if you go to your like Islamic Finder um, thing that shows you when the prayer times are, there are different settings for setting the various times based on the way Saudi Arabia calculates the
Oh
way
yeah.
Egypt does it, and
Yeah.
they're all different points in the sky for the sun.
Hmm.
Who knows which one to pick? It's so ridiculous.
Well, I think we should talk about it. I personally go by nautical twilight. I'll say that
Nautical.
nautical twilight because it's called that because if you were out on the ocean, you would actually be able to see the sun on the horizon, and I think that goes with the idea of you can separate the white from the black thread. You know, whereas a lot of the apps that I download go by astronomical twilight, which is an hour and a half or sometimes 2 hours before sunrise, and it's still dark. That is nighttime. You cannot
Okay,
tell
every
me
time I've
that.
ever prayed Fajr, it's still dark.
I mean, yeah, nautical twilight is not it's super light outside, but I don't know. It seems to make more sense to me. But it's
Legit.
another conversation. It definitely is time to break fast, and I would really like to do that. So thank you for joining us
Yeah, it's
this
been
week for
fun.
our discussion. We'll see you back again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, so
And we will just be discussing apparently maybe Fajr, or maybe we'll discuss
gay
homosexuality
stuff.
in Islam
It'll be gay
or
stuff.
something. I don't know. We'll let you know what the topic is.
Yeah,
2 weeks from now.
inshallah.
All right.
Don't forget to comment, favorite, and subscribe.
Yes. If you make
Smash
this
that
a
like
YouTube
button.
video, I'm gonna point. Don't they always do pointing? Do this.
Oh, we should put some things in the video. Anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you for being with us this week.